looking at some of the speeches from Joe Biden recently and with the legislation and tax policies he's hoping to introduce. And what you see in that is a recognition of the Great Reset, the end of the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency, the recognition of the Triffin dilemma, which was inevitably going to cause the destruction of the U.S. dollar. And that is because he wants to take the U.S. 50% renewable. And if you don't have a petrodollar, you don't have the dollar, right? So this, mainstream media sort of economist here, Josh Wolf, tweeted, "Crypto makes a ton of sense if we lived in utopia with global peace and slim variations in governance and human rights. It ought to be the basis for universal system. Until then, the U.S. dollar has far-reaching strategic importance, precisely why China and Russia want it gone."
This is an interesting inflection point that we are living through now. The fall of the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency, the rise of Bitcoin as a universal hard money that has great attributes that will bring peace and monetize peace versus fiat money, which is really the monetization of war and violence. And this gentleman, Josh Wolf, he's having trouble wrapping his mind around it, which is not hard to understand because it's a very big concept. You really have to take a step back and look at the big picture. And that's not easy to do for a lot of folks.
As we get into this conversation, into this report from Lynn Alden, what you'll see is that China it does not wish the dollar gone. In fact, they've benefited massively from it. So they've just played the game very well. They understood the Triffin dilemma, the fact that anybody with a reserve currency, any nation with a reserve currency has to run huge trade deficits and thus inevitably weaken themselves and collapse their own currency. So they saw that. They're not stupid. And they saw that that was coming. Unlike Saudi Arabia, unlike Europe, unlike Japan before it, it didn't play the game. It stopped playing the game in 2013 when it did the Belt and Road instead of recycling all their surplus into treasuries. So that's where everything has changed since 2013. And we're heading toward a neutral reserve currency unit of account like Bitcoin. You had responded to him, nope, elastic fiat US dollar promotes violence and war. Inelastic Bitcoin promotes peace. There is no reason to be defeatist with Bitcoin ridding us of fiat and central banks. The report that we're going to get to, the fraying of the U.S. global currency reserve system from Lynn Alden, it mentions exactly that a lot of violence is needed in order to sustain the U.S. dollar as reserve currency backed by oil. So it has to resort to violence in order to continue to force people to accept the US dollar, being the pricing mechanism for oil. But right now, so you're saying that the fact that, basically Bitcoin promotes peace because it is inelastic like that.
Right. It's hard money. It's like St. Francis of Assisi, I believe, said, God, let me be chaste, but maybe tomorrow, right? We know that in order to survive as a species, we're going to have to embrace peace. And these childish games of throwing bricks at each other have run their conclusion because we've basically exhausted the planet's carrying capacity for humans. And the planet is choking on its human population right now, and it's now sending a pretty strong signal that Mother Earth would prefer it if humans were no longer around. So as a result, the only way we can ingratiate ourselves with Mother Nature is to have a breakout in peace and to show her that we are, in fact, mature as a species and not childish throwing our poop around. And so Josh Wolf was unwilling to get out of the diapers and stand up and be an adult.
Right. And when the Triffin dilemma, what happens to the reserve currency nation like the U.S. dollar post-World War II, Keynes saw it coming. He knew what was going to happen. And what would happen is you've got to have the trade deficit. And that means you got to send your gold overseas. So we unpegged in 1971. And what we did instead was, pegged to the petrodollar, which extended the game for a bit. But if you don't have gold to send overseas, you've got to have your basically your industrial base. So that has been hollowed out since 1971. That was exactly as a result of the U.S. dollar as reserve. You have to send the U.S. dollars overseas. So that's destabilized the domestic population, as we see constantly getting worse and worse, as the hopelessness, as the dawning of the realization that it's not going back with this system, that there's no getting our jobs back no matter what. They're all in China, Vietnam, Cambodia, all of Asia, Mexico, Latin America. They're not coming back here. You write, again, in response to this guy, Josh Wolf, in my view, having a global Bitcoin standard separating state from money, universally accessible, has the power to affect all people in a profoundly positive way, demonetizing war and violence. I can see this very clearly. I'm not the only one.
Right. Well, to your point that you've been making really for quite some time is that the empire of debt, the U.S. dollar's world reserve currency, is really hugely penalizing to the American population. And we see that what's happened now. Because the trade deficits are a prerequisite for having world reserve currency, because in order to have people buy your stuff with dollars, you've got to ship those dollars out. And so that's what we've been doing for 40 years and made all these other countries super rich, like China, and impoverished the United States.
Before we continue, help us by smashing that YouTube like button and subscribe now to this channel. This shows the algorithm that you value the information, and it helps us spread this message. Sharing is caring. Please like and subscribe now. Thank you. And now, let's continue.
And as you've pointed out yourself a few times, look at Europe. Once they lost their empires, actually quality of life for Europeans went up. Once they had to shut down all their colonial outposts, European life, quality of life went up. So presumably the U.S., if there wasn't the world reserve currency called the U.S. dollar, and we shut down the empire of debt, and we shut down the 400 or 500 military bases we have around the world that do absolutely nothing but drain the coffers of the state, the quality of life in America would zoom higher. And that's what Josh Wolf doesn't really understand. He likes to pull out a few tropes about our existential enemies doing this and doing that, and it's all very Hollywood. But the economics of it don't support his jingoism, and the economics are established. And the fact of the matter is, if the U.S. dollar were allowed to collapse, quality of life for the average American would skyrocket.
Josh Wolf is not an average American. He is a blue tick New York Times, Wall Street Journal sort of editorialist. Those are the beneficiaries. They receive a very exorbitant privilege from the rest of the world. They get to print dollars. It's even less work than the Saudi princes, the 7,000 princes have to do. They at least have to drill a well. These guys don't even have to drill a well. They just sit there and drill dollars, like print dollars. So, you know, this brings us to the fraying of this. And this is what we're seeing with the very elite versus the population, the winners versus the losers, as Hillary called them, the deplorables versus the ruling class. So Lynn Alden responded to this conversation as well. And she said, in response to Josh Wolf saying that the U.S. dollar is the best thing to ever happen, she's like, quite to the contrary. U.S. dollar hegemony continues to benefit Chinese interests over U.S. interests. A small portion of U.S. residents benefit from the system as structured, while most U.S. workers get displaced under the current system. Hence, populism emerges. She just shows a chart of 2000. Of course, as we always point out, that's the pivotal year. That's the last year as Clinton exited the White House, passed the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which allowed derivatives to basically hollow out the U.S. economy and the U.S. elite to extract huge amounts of equity. But also they repealed the Glass-Steagall Act to also destabilize the financial system, and they elevated China into the WTO on favored nation status. So the blue, all that blue you see, that was the United States represented as the #1 global trade partner back in 2000. That's the position we were in 2000. This is 2018. Red is all China. So China has become, in those 18 years, the #1 global trading partner for all of those countries.
Yeah, and I can tell you why it accelerated like at this incredible pace was that starting in 2000, we started to have no compunction whatsoever about bailing out corrupt bankers. Mm-hmm. And that's what accelerated the collapse. And you see that in the collapse in the money velocity numbers. We simply, as New York City did in the 70s, municipal governments threw the keys to Wall Street. Lazard Frere was a banker. And it was the rise of Donald Trump, as a matter of fact, came out of that. So the federal government is mimicking this behavior particularly since 2000, saying we in Washington give up. We're abdicating our role as representatives of the people. We're simply going to throw the keys to the bankers. And the bankers went ahead and printed themselves $25 trillion worth of money, and they kept most of it. When they were caught committing fraud, Eric Holder, of course, so the Attorney General under Bill Clinton, would give them a pass, like a papal indulgence of the Middle Ages, and say, look, these guys are systemically important. As Trump would say, they could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they'd be no penalty whatsoever. That's Jamie Dimon's life. So now we have the results, and we have some crisis, and we have people like Josh Wolf, who's a blue check guy, furiously stenographer that is, pumping out talking points directly from, the propaganda center in Washington. And, but it's not washing anymore. People, particularly the millennials, are like, we don't believe a single word you're saying.
What to do in such a situation? Inform yourself and keep your financial education strong. We from the Compact Group offer our loyal subscribers a free educational portal with first-hand monetary, financial, and economic knowledge. Enter our invite-only Insider Club by clicking the link below. You will get access to first-class information far earlier than the rest. We have prepared a special deal for all our members where you can access a giant pool of Robert Kiyosaki's financial wisdom for just $1. To find out more, simply click the link below and join our Insider Club absolutely free. But there is more you can and should do. Build up several streams of income. More and more people realize that they have to take their future in their own hands, but they don't know how and where to start. We from Compact offer our Insider Club members unique opportunities. Strengthen your financial muscle and get the edge. Click the link below. Become part of our free Insider Club. No financial obligations. But there's one important thing you have to know. You have to become active. So do it now. Become active and see you on the other side.